I think it's important not just to critique the other side, but to cast a better vision. Let's take justice, for example. Could you give us sort of divergent definitions of a critical theory definition of justice versus a biblical idea of justice?
Sure. So biblically, I think a good definition, I think it goes back to like the Greeks, but it fits the Bible too. Justice means rendering unto each person what is their due, or giving them what they deserve. And of course, that starts with giving God what he deserves, which is our everything, our heart, mind, soul, and strength, loving him supremely. That's justice. We are being unjust towards God if we are refusing to worship him and acknowledge him. But that also applies to other people. So we have a duty to provide for our families. We have a duty to provide for our neighbors, to love our neighbors, to care for them. And then, of course, it extends also into law. So you can talk about unjust laws, like abortion law, right? Laws permitting abortion, laws permitting slavery. Those are unjust laws. And so Christians, part of biblical justice is making sure that our laws as a society are just. So there's some overlap there between what critical theorists might say is a requirement of social justice and what Christians might say is biblical justice. That said, critical theorists do not define justice vertically at all, period, because they're not a theistic ideology. But they also define social justice to mean, this is a quote, the elimination of all forms of social oppression, where that can be based on a person's race, class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, etc. So what critical theorists believe is that society is divided into oppressor groups and oppressed groups along lines of race, class, and gender. And that's something called the social binary. There are all these oppressor groups and oppressed groups. There's men oppressing women. There's whites oppressing people of color. There are there are straight people oppressing LGBTQ people. And social justice means destroying the systems and structures which produce the social binary. So they want to level the playing field so that there's no ruling class which imposes its values on culture. There's the idea that men impose patriarchal values on culture. Those values oppress women. Whites impose their white supremacist values and norms on culture, and that's white supremacy, and that oppresses people of color. Straight people apply their heterosexist norms and values to culture. That's heterosexism. Well, critical theory works to dismantle all of those hegemonic norms, all of those values that are imposed on culture by the ruling classes to justify their own dominance, to get rid of those things and to create a society in which all groups are treated equally. There's no one dominant narrative that justifies anyone having social prominence. That's their definition.
Yeah.
So right off the bat, something like gender, they would say the gender binary is oppressive because it creates a class of the people that are normal and are doing what the gender binary is normal. Then you have people that are transgender are outside of that binary, that's that normality. So they're labeled as deviant and it's unnatural. It's not. So they would say that's oppressive. The very idea of gender binary is oppressive. Mm-hmm. Or the idea that marriage is between one man and one woman for life. That's an oppressive idea. It's a patriarchal, heterosexist idea that must be dismantled in the name of social justice. So there's lots there, but that bottom line is that that's two different definitions of justice. And some of the things that they would say are unjust, we would say are actually just. They're God's design for humanity, and so we should actually not dismantle them. We should actually value what God values. So it's a huge disjunction there.
Yeah, I remember hearing when BLM really started making headlines. It was, George Floyd, and we were all at home for COVID and we're just watching the news and getting, inflamed in one way or another politically. And I remember hearing critiques of the BLM movement early on that I still hear today, that it's wrapped up in Marxism and that it initially, although they removed this from their website, initially it sought to dismantle the nuclear family. And that really struck a lot of people as odd. From what I'm hearing from you, it would make total sense because all these critical theory movements are sort of in cahoots. They're intertwined in a way. There's an expectation that if you are a proponent of critical race theory, you're also a proponent of queer theory, for example, and dismantling those systems as well. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and actually that's the notion. What's happened is all of these critical social theories, critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, they've sort of coalesced within an intersectional framework. So the term intersectionality was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, a critical race theorist in 1989. And she used that term to describe the way in which, say, a black woman is doubly oppressed. She occupies this unique social location where she's both a woman and she's black, and both of those identities shape her experience of oppression. You can't separate them out. You can't say, well, you're oppressed just because you're black, you're oppressed just because you're a woman. Well, being a black woman makes you uniquely vulnerable to discrimination. But she intended that to be expanded to other categories like your sexuality, your physical ability, your class. All these other categories they can make you triply, quadruply oppressed, or triply, quadruply, multiply privileged. So you have sort of a hierarchy of oppression now. And what that does, though, is because she's arguing that these different oppressions are inextricably linked. You can't just say, oh, you're just oppressed by racism. No, your racial oppression intersects with your gender oppression and your sexual oppression. Because of that, you can't then pull them apart and treat them differently. So this is an incredible quote from a 1993 anthology called Words That Wound. It was co-authored by 4 of the co-founders of critical race theory, Mary Matsuda, Charles Lawrence, Richard Delgado, and Kimberly Crenshaw. And this is 4 years after the movement coalesced. They list 6 defining elements of critical race theory. And number 6 says that they're committed to dismantling racism, sexism, and heterosexism through, quote, massive social transformation. And that critical race theory, its defining element is it's part of a larger liberatory enterprise that seeks to liberate all of these oppressed social groups. So when people say things like, well, we can eat the meat and spit out the bones of critical race theory, I'm like, this is a defining element of CRT, that their co-founders are saying you cannot just take one thing you like from CRT and ignore sexism and heterosexism and homophobia and transphobia. All of these oppressions are experienced simultaneously, and our movement is committed to all of these things, of abolishing all of these systemic oppressions.